I watch the airport monitors flicker red with flight canceled as Hurricane Miranda tears through the East Coast, and my phone buzzes with the message that destroys everything. Bella, so sorry. The car broke down in this weather. James and his mother are stranded too. You understand, right? Family comes first. David. The words blur together as I read them again and again in the harsh fluorescent lighting of LaGuardia Terminal C, surrounded by hundreds of other stranded passengers, who at least have the comfort of knowing their loved ones didn't deliberately abandon them during the worst storm in decades. And I realize with crystalline clarity that David Park, my fiancé of 3 years, the man I've supported financially and emotionally through every struggle, has chosen this moment of ultimate vulnerability to show me exactly how little I mean to him when his convenience is at stake. The Myanmar business trip for Chen International had been grueling, 2 weeks of negotiations for shipping contracts that would secure our family's empire for another generation, and all I wanted was to come home to David's arms and celebrate our engagement party that we'd planned for months. But instead, I'm standing here in my Chanel travel suit that now feels like a costume for a play where I'm the only one who doesn't know I'm the fool. My fingers shake as I scroll through Instagram and see David's story from an hour ago, him laughing with his mother, Mrs. Park, and his brother James at what should have been our engagement venue, the Plaza Hotel's Grand Ballroom, with the caption, "Family dinner at the Plaza. Some people just don't appreciate what really matters in life." The 3 of them are toasting with champagne that I paid for, celebrating at a party funded by my family's money, while I'm trapped at an airport during a Category 4 hurricane because their broken-down car was more important than my safety. And I can see in the comments that he's telling everyone I chose work over family and that I'm too career-focused to prioritize relationships. The rage builds in my chest like the storm outside as I remember every moment of the past 3 years when I should have seen the signs, when my parents warned me about Phoenix men who marry up for status and financial security, when Mrs. Park would call me with tears in her voice about David's sick father, who needed expensive medical treatments that somehow always coincided with David wanting new clothes or a better apartment or investment money for his brilliant business ideas that never materialized into anything except excuses for why he needed more of my resources. I gave him an internship at Chen International. Despite his mediocre qualifications from a second-tier business school, I paid for his MBA program when he claimed his scholarships fell through. I bought him a Rolex for his birthday because Mrs. Park convinced me that successful men need to look the part, and I even put the down payment on the penthouse apartment where we were supposed to live after our wedding because David said owning property together would prove our commitment. But now, standing in this airport while Hurricane Miranda howls outside and David posts happy photos from our engagement party without me, I understand that I was never his fiancé. I was his personal ATM with legs, a convenient source of funding and social elevation that he could discard the moment maintaining our relationship became inconvenient, and the realization cuts deeper than any physical pain because it means that every kiss, every I love you, every moment of intimacy was just him performing affection to keep the money flowing. The other passengers around me are calling family members, arranging alternative transportation, helping each other with charging stations and shared snacks, creating community in crisis, while I sit alone with my designer luggage and my expensive phone that keeps showing me evidence of my own stupidity, and I know that even if I survive this hurricane, I'll never survive the humiliation of realizing that the man I loved never loved me back. Power goes out, emergency lighting only, and I huddle in Terminal C with hundreds of other stranded passengers while the hurricane rages outside, and every time I try calling David, it goes straight to voicemail. But I can see him posting laughing photos on social media from what should have been our engagement party, and the contrast between his warm, well-fed celebration and my cold, hungry nightmare becomes a metaphor for our entire relationship that I was too blind to see before tonight. The airport transforms into a dystopian landscape where the wealthy and poor suffer equally under flickering emergency lights, but somehow I feel more alone than anyone because at least the other passengers were abandoned by circumstances, not by the person who promised to love and protect them, and as the hours drag by and my phone battery dies, I'm forced to confront the reality that David isn't coming, isn't even thinking about me except as an obstacle to his social climbing that he's finally found a way to eliminate. An elderly woman next to me shares her granola bar and asks why a young lady like me is traveling alone during a hurricane. And when I explain about my fiancé's car trouble, She gives me a look that's part pity and part knowing wisdom before saying, "Honey, cars don't break down for 3 hours at the exact moment your engagement party starts." And the simple truth of her statement hits me like a physical blow, because even strangers can see what I refuse to acknowledge. The temperature drops as the night wears on and the airport's heating system struggles against the storm, and I develop a fever that's part illness and part shock as my body finally processes the emotional trauma of complete betrayal, and I listen to other passengers share stories of disappointment and abandonment that make me realize David's cruelty isn't unique. It's just particularly calculated and long-term in its execution. A businessman talks about his wife leaving him for his best friend. A college student cries about her boyfriend cheating with her roommate. And a mother explains how her ex-husband disappeared when their child was born with special needs. And I understand that I'm part of an ancient pattern of people who mistake manipulation for love and convenience for commitment. But what makes David's betrayal so much worse is the systematic nature of it. The way he and his mother planned and executed a 3-year campaign to drain my resources while positioning themselves as the victims of my privilege. And as I shiver in the airport chair that's become my bed for the night, I remember all the times Mrs. Park would sigh heavily and talk about how difficult it must be for David to date someone so wealthy when his family was struggling, making me feel guilty for having advantages I'd done nothing to earn while she was actively working to separate me from those advantages for her own family's benefit. The manipulation was so subtle and so consistent that I started believing I owed them compensation for the accident of my birth into the Chen family, that my wealth was somehow unfair to David, and that sharing it was the only way to prove my love was genuine, and now I see that they were teaching me to doubt my own worth while inflating theirs. As dawn approaches and I drift in and out of feverish sleep, I overhear 2 airport workers discussing the storm damage and how many people were hospitalized during the night. And one of them mentions seeing social media posts from some rich kids partying at the plaza while regular folks suffered in the storm. And I realize that David's engagement party without me has become a symbol of wealth insensitivity that will follow me for years. That his narrative about my selfishness and priority problems is already spreading through social media and will become the accepted version of events because people love stories about privileged people getting their comeuppance, even when the privilege was earned by generations of hard work, and the comeuppance is orchestrated by manipulative social climbers. When I finally get phone service back at dawn, I discover David didn't just abandon me in the hurricane. He used my absence to forge my signature on Chen International documents, transferring my personal shares to a shell company controlled by his mother. And the engagement party continued with him, announcing to everyone that I was too immature and unreliable to be a proper wife. And I understand that the hurricane was never an inconvenience to his plans. It was the perfect cover for the financial heist he and Mrs. Park had been planning since the day we met. My hands shake as I scroll through emails from my assistant, my lawyer, and Chen International's board members, all marked urgent, and all revealing different pieces of the elaborate con that David and his mother executed while I was trapped at the airport, and I see that they used my laptop passwords, which I'd shared with David for convenience, to access my personal investment accounts and business documents, creating a trail of consensual financial transfers that would be nearly impossible to prove were fraudulent because technically my own devices and passwords were used to authorize them. The shell company, Prosperity Holdings LLC, was established 3 months ago with Mrs. Prosperity Holdings LLC, Hark as the registered agent and David as the primary beneficiary, and they've been slowly moving my assets into it using forged documents that copy my signature with disturbing accuracy, suggesting they've been practicing this theft for months while kissing me goodnight and telling me they loved me. The most devastating email comes from my father's assistant, explaining that Daddy had a heart episode during an emergency board meeting called to address Isabella's erratic financial behavior and questionable judgment, and that David had positioned himself as the concerned fiancé trying to help the family understand my recent instability and concerning decision-making patterns, painting himself as the reasonable voice trying to protect Chen International from my supposed mental breakdown. The engagement party had transformed into a sympathy gathering where David played the role of the long-suffering boyfriend finally forced to admit that his wealthy girlfriend was spiraling out of control and dozens of New York's most influential families heard him describe my obsession with work and inability to prioritize relationships as evidence that I was unfit to inherit the family business. I call my best friend Maya, expecting support and comfort, but instead hear her carefully modulated voice explaining that she's concerned about my recent behavior and thinks maybe David has valid points about my work-life balance issues. And I realize that he's been poisoning my relationships for months, having private conversations with my friends where he expressed worry about my mental health and dedication to helping me heal, positioning himself as the loving boyfriend, sacrificing his own happiness to support his troubled girlfriend. Maya mentions that she helped David clean out my things from his apartment after I stormed out before the trip, and that she thought it was mature of him to donate my designer wedding dress to charity rather than holding it hostage during this difficult time. And I understand that they've rewritten history so completely that even my closest friends believe I'm the villain in my own love story. The financial damage extends beyond my personal accounts to Chen International itself, where David convinced the board that my impulsive decision to take the Myanmar trip during hurricane season showed poor judgment that could affect the company's stability, and he suggested that perhaps my shares should be held in trust until I worked through my personal issues with professional help, meaning psychological evaluation that would declare me incompetent and transfer control of my inheritance to trustees who could be more easily manipulated than I was. The stock price has already dropped 12% based on succession concerns and questions about leadership stability, and I see that David's 3-year plan wasn't just to steal my money, it was to steal my entire identity, my family's business, and my future, leaving me with nothing while he and his mother live in the luxury I was born to inherit. But the cruelest detail comes in a text message from David's brother James, sent at 3 a.m, saying, "Thanks for finally showing your true colors, princess." David deserves better than a spoiled brat who abandons her family when things get tough. Enjoy your pity party. And I realize that the entire Park family has convinced themselves that they're the victims of my privilege, that stealing from me is somehow justice for the crime of being born wealthy, and that they genuinely believe they've earned everything they've taken because they've convinced themselves that I owe them compensation for my advantages, transforming theft into moral crusade and greed into righteous indignation. Then I opened my eyes and realized I had been reborn, standing in my corner office at Chen International exactly 1 week before the Myanmar business trip, staring at David's text asking me to trust him with some investment advice, while Mrs. is staring and Park's voice echoes from the speakerphone suggesting I sign some simple paperwork to help David build his credit, and the familiar scene plays out like a movie I've watched before. Except this time I know how it ends, and I have the power to change every single detail. The sunlight streaming through my floor-to-ceiling windows feels different this time, sharper and more real, as if I'm seeing color for the first time after living in black and white. And David lounges in my leather guest chair with the casual ownership of someone who believes he's already won. His legs spread wide and his smile too confident for a man whose only accomplishments are manipulating his girlfriend and stealing from her family. Mrs. Park's voice through the speakerphone carries that familiar sickly sweet tone that used to make me feel guilty for having advantages she lacked, but now I hear the calculating hunger underneath every word. The way she pauses strategically to let her fake sadness sink in, the subtle pressure wrapped in maternal concern that I once mistook for genuine care about my well-being. "Isabella, darling," Mrs. Park coos through the phone. "I know you're so busy with important business matters, but David's credit score is suffering because he's never had opportunities to build financial history, and you know how important that will be for your future together. So if you could just co-sign these small loan documents, it would help him establish the foundation for your shared life." And I watch David's face as she speaks, seeing the predatory satisfaction in his eyes that I was too besotted to notice before. The way he nods along with her script like an actor who's rehearsed his lines perfectly. The stack of papers on my desk looks innocuous enough, loan applications and credit cards and investment account forms that would give David access to my financial life under the guise of building our future together. But now I see them for what they really are, the carefully crafted tools of a sophisticated con designed to transfer my wealth to the Park family while making me complicit in my own destruction. Every document has been researched and prepared with legal precision, every clause designed to give them maximum access while providing plausible deniability about their true intentions. And I realized that David's mediocre performance at business school wasn't because he lacked intelligence. It was because he was spending his time studying how to commit white-collar crime instead of legitimate business practices. "Bella," David says, his voice carrying that particular note of patient condescension that used to make me feel like a difficult child who needed guidance. "You seem distracted today. Is everything okay? You know you can talk to me about anything that's bothering you." And the manufactured concern in his tone makes my skin crawl because I can see the manipulation so clearly now. The way he positions himself as my emotional caretaker while systematically destroying my life. The false intimacy designed to make me doubt my own instincts and surrender my judgment to his supposedly superior wisdom. But this time, instead of apologizing for my mood and signing whatever papers he's brought to steal from me, I hang up on Mrs. Park mid-sentence, the click of the disconnect button echoing through my office like a gunshot, and David's expression shifts from confident smugness to confusion to something approaching panic as he realizes that the script has changed and he doesn't know his lines anymore. "What are you doing?" he asks, his voice losing its practiced smoothness. "My mother was trying to help us plan our future," and I smile at him with all the warmth of a winter storm as I gather up his carefully prepared theft documents and drop them directly into my paper shredder. "David," I say, my voice clear and steady in a way it never was during our original relationship, "I think it's time for you to leave my office. Security will escort you out if you need assistance finding the door." And I watch his face cycle through disbelief, anger, and fear as he realizes that his 3-year investment in manipulating me has just been liquidated, that the naive heiress who signed whatever he put in front of her has disappeared and been replaced by someone who sees him exactly as he is. A mediocre man with expensive tastes and flexible morals who thought he could steal an empire by seducing its princess. I watch David's confidence crumble as I systematically remove every advantage I ever gave him, starting with the Chen International internship that I now realize he never deserved. And when he asks why I'm being so cruel, I smile and tell him I've decided to focus on people who actually value my family's generosity. And the panic in his eyes tells me he's beginning to understand that his comfortable life was built entirely on my naive goodwill, and now that foundation is cracking beneath his feet. The first domino falls when I call human resources and request a complete review of David's work performance, free from the protective influence I'd unconsciously provided for 3 years. And what they discover would be laughable if it weren't so pathetic. David has been plagiarizing reports from junior analysts, claiming credit for projects completed by his teammates, and spending most of his workday on personal calls and social media instead of the intensive research he claimed to be conducting for strategic development. His supervisor, Jennifer Chen, no relation despite the name, explains that she's been documenting David's incompetence for months but held back from formal complaints because she assumed I wanted him protected, and now that I've given permission for honest evaluation, the file she produces reads like a case study in workplace mediocrity disguised as ambition. "Miss Chen," Jennifer says, her relief evident as she spreads David's performance records across my conference table. "I've been wanting to address these issues for so long, but Miss Park always implied that criticism of his work would be taken as criticism of your judgment, and frankly, none of us wanted to put you in that position. And I realized that David has been using my feelings for him as a shield against accountability, making my relationship with him into a weapon against anyone who might expose his incompetence." The other employees had watched him coast on my protection while they worked overtime to cover for his failures, and their resentment toward him was complicated by their loyalty to me, creating a workplace dynamic where my love for David was slowly poisoning the team's respect for my leadership abilities. The second wave of destruction comes when I audit the emergency loans I'd given David for his father's supposed medical crises, and discover that Mr. Park's health insurance covered everything David claimed I needed to pay for, that the hospital bills were doctored using Photoshop software David learned in his graphic design electives, and that most of the money went to luxury purchases that David hid from me by having them delivered to his mother's apartment. The receipts I find in his desk drawer tell the real story. Armani suits charged to medical expenses, a Cartier watch listed as pharmacy costs, and a week-long vacation to Barbados documented as recuperation travel for Mr. Park's recovery. And I understand that every tear Mrs. Park shed about their family's suffering was rehearsed theater designed to manipulate my guilt about having advantages they lacked. David's attempt to maintain his lifestyle without my financial support becomes comedy gold as I watch him struggle to pay for the expensive habits I unknowingly funded, and his secretary girlfriend, Michelle, starts noticing that his lunch invitations have downgraded from Michelin-starred restaurants to food trucks, that his weekend plans shifted from Hamptons house parties to Netflix marathons in his studio apartment, and that the generous gifts that characterized their affair have dried up completely now that he's spending his actual salary instead of my money. Michelle's Instagram stories document her growing confusion about David's temporary financial difficulties, and I can see in her tagged photos that she's already starting to flirt with other men at the corporate events David can no longer afford to attend. The social destruction accelerates when I stop including David in exclusive events where my family's connections provided him access to networking opportunities he never could have created himself, and the investment brokers, corporate lawyers, and venture capitalists who had begun treating him as a serious player suddenly realize he has no independent credentials or achievements worth their attention. David's LinkedIn connections start declining his meeting requests, his business cards get filed in the circular cabinet, and the country club membership that Mrs. Park had been bragging about to her friends gets revoked for non-payment when David can't afford the dues I'd been covering under the category of relationship expenses that I'd stupidly believed were investments in our shared future. But the most satisfying destruction comes when I stop protecting David's reputation through my own social capital, and my friends and colleagues start sharing their honest opinions about him without fear of hurting my feelings, and the picture that emerges is of a man who was universally disliked, but tolerated because everyone assumed I saw something in him that they missed. Isabella? My friend Catherine confesses over lunch at the Yale Club. I know you loved him. But David always struck me as exactly the kind of man my grandmother warned me about, handsome enough to turn heads but too lazy to keep them turned, and suddenly, every woman in my social circle feels free to mention David's wandering eyes, his inappropriate comments, and his obvious calculations about which conversations were worth his attention based on the perceived social status of the people involved. While David scrambles to maintain his fake image, I reconnect with Alexander Montenegro, the quiet heir to Montenegro Holdings who sat behind me in every business ethics class, always offering genuine insights while David copied homework, and I realize Alexander's steadfast presence in my life was never coincidence but quiet, patient devotion that was so secure in itself it never needed to demand attention or steal credit or manipulate circumstances to prove its worth. Alexander Montenegro represents everything David pretended to be: legitimately wealthy, genuinely intelligent, and authentically kind without expecting rewards for basic human decency. And when I call him to discuss a potential business partnership between Chen International and Montenegro Holdings, his response teaches me the difference between earned confidence and performed arrogance. Isabella, he says, his voice warm with genuine pleasure, I've been hoping for an opportunity to work together professionally. Your family's shipping empire and our sustainable energy initiatives could create something remarkable for both our companies and the environment. And I hear in his tone the respect for my business acumen that David never offered, the assumption that I'm a capable partner rather than a convenient resource. The contrast between Alexander's steady presence and David's attention-seeking behavior becomes obvious when I review our shared history through the lens of adult understanding rather than teenage infatuation, and I remember how Alexander would help me with complex economic theories without expecting anything in return, how he'd listen to my ideas about international commerce without trying to improve them or claim partial credit, and how he'd defend my positions in class discussions when other students dismissed them as daddy's money talking, instead of recognizing the legitimate business insights I developed through years of watching Chen International operate. David had seemed more exciting because he was always creating drama that demanded resolution, always presenting problems that needed my solutions, always generating emotional intensity that felt like passion but was actually manipulation designed to keep me too busy managing his chaos to notice his fundamental inadequacy. Alexander's family wealth comes from 3 generations of building Montenegro Holdings from a small engineering firm into a global leader in renewable energy technology, and his personal accomplishments include 2 graduate degrees from MIT, 3 patents for solar panel efficiency improvements, and a reputation for business ethics that makes him sought after for corporate boards and environmental initiatives, achievements that stand in stark contrast to David's resume of family connections, borrowed credentials, and manipulated opportunities. When Alexander mentions that he owns the penthouse building where I live, it's not a boast, but a casual reference to one small part of his portfolio. And when he offers to show me the green technology installations that make the building carbon neutral, it's because he's genuinely excited about sustainable development, not because he's trying to impress me with his wealth. Our first business lunch reveals how different real partnership feels from David's performative relationship, because Alexander asks about my opinions on shipping route optimization and supply chain sustainability instead of explaining to me how international commerce works. And he treats my insights about Asian markets as valuable intelligence rather than cute observations from a privileged princess playing at business. Your experience with the Myanmar negotiations could be crucial for our expansion into Southeast Asian markets, Alexander says, leaning forward with genuine interest. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how environmental initiatives are received by traditional shipping families. And I realize that he sees my background as an asset to leverage rather than a resource to exploit. The emotional safety Alexander provides feels revolutionary after years of David's calculated affection, because Alexander never makes me feel guilty for my advantages or responsible for his problems, never positions my care for him as evidence of character flaws I need to correct, and never treats my generosity as something he's entitled to receive rather than grateful to experience. When I mention the stress of recent business decisions, Alexander offers to listen without trying to fix everything, and when I express doubts about my leadership abilities, he reminds me of specific instances where my judgment proved sound, instead of offering generic reassurance that feels hollow. And I understand that this is how people show love when they're secure enough in themselves to focus on their partner's well-being instead of their own needs. But what makes Alexander truly dangerous to my heart is how he demonstrates care through consistent actions rather than dramatic gestures, how he remembers details about my preferences without making them into performances of devotion, and how he builds trust through reliability rather than demanding it through emotional manipulation. And I begin to understand that the intensity I mistook for love with David was actually the exhaustion of constantly managing someone else's emotional volatility, while my own needs were systematically ignored and my own worth was consistently undermined. 7 days before Hurricane Miranda, I invite David and his mother to my penthouse for what they think is a makeup dinner, but what's actually their final performance, where they'll reveal their true nature to a carefully selected audience of influential New York society members, including the board members of every company where David hoped to work after destroying me, and I watch them walk into my trap with the confidence of predators who have never considered that their prey might learn to hunt. The guest list for my dinner party reads like a who's who of Manhattan's power structure. The Chen International Board of Directors, the Meyer family, whose old money influence spans 3 centuries, representatives from Rothschild Investment Banking, the Monaco Consul General whose friendship with my family opens European doors, and Alexander Montenegro, whose environmental technologies are revolutionizing how progressive wealth thinks about legacy building. Each invitation specified formal attire and mentioned that I'd be introducing David as my fiancé to the wider business community, language that I knew would send Mrs. Stoplis Park into a frenzy of social climbing preparation, and David into overdrive trying to present himself as worthy of these connections. My penthouse provides the perfect theater for their destruction, floor-to-ceiling windows offering 360-degree views of Manhattan, contemporary art that whispers wealth without shouting it, and an intimate dining space that forces conversation and makes private aside impossible, ensuring that every word David and Mrs. Park speak will be heard by exactly the people who could destroy their social climbing dreams forever. Alexander arrives early to help with hosting duties, and his presence provides a stark contrast to David's nervous energy and Mrs. Park's obvious social anxiety disguised as excitement, demonstrating how people with actual class navigate high-pressure situations with grace rather than performance. David arrives overdressed in a too-expensive suit that screams insecurity, while Mrs. Park wears what appears to be her life savings in designer knockoffs that fool no one but make her feel armored for battle, and their behavior from the moment they enter my home reveals the fundamental difference between people born to privilege and people desperate to acquire it. David immediately starts name-dropping business school professors and internship supervisors, trying to establish credentials with men who could buy and sell his entire family history, while Mrs. Park gravitates toward the women with the transparent hunger of someone who believes proximity to power will transfer status by osmosis. "Mrs. Chen," Mrs. Park gushes to Alexander's mother, who's visiting from Europe, "I've been so looking forward to meeting Isabella's family friends. David and I have been working so hard to help Isabella develop more mature priorities, and it's wonderful to see her finally understanding the importance of family stability over career obsessions." And the immediate silence that follows her words tells me that she's just made the first of many mistakes that will define her evening. Alexander's mother, who built Montenegro Holdings alongside her husband and currently serves on the boards of 3 major environmental foundations, gives Mrs. Park the kind of smile that precedes diplomatic warfare, sweet enough to mask the sharpness of what's coming next. The conversation during cocktails reveals David and Mrs. Park's complete misunderstanding of how wealthy families actually operate, as they make increasingly desperate attempts to position themselves as suitable additions to the social hierarchy, while simultaneously demonstrating their fundamental incompatibility with its values. And I watch the other guests exchange glances that communicate volumes about their assessment of my supposed fiancé and his ambitious mother. David tries to bond with the Meyer patriarch by criticizing spoiled rich kids who don't understand real work, apparently forgetting that everyone present inherited wealth and built upon it rather than resenting it, while Mrs. Park attempts to impress the Rothschild representative by describing her plans to modernize Isabella's approach to philanthropy as if charitable giving were a personality flaw requiring correction. But the moment that seals their fate comes when Mrs. Lockentimon Park, emboldened by wine and desperation, decides to present her vision for my future to the assembled power brokers. Isabella is such a sweet girl, but she's been spoiled by too much independence. And David and I believe she needs guidance learning how to be a proper wife and mother, instead of pretending she can run a business empire. And the shocked silence that follows reveals that she's just insulted not only me but every powerful woman in the room, including Alexander's mother, the Meyer daughters who run their family foundation, and the Monaco consul general, whose wife built her own telecommunications empire. While David and his mother scramble through the storm in their broken-down car because I withdrew my driver and car service, I stand in my penthouse watching Hurricane Miranda rage against reinforced windows while Alexander brings me hot chocolate, and we watch the city weather the storm together, safe and warm 40 stories above the chaos. And I understand that this is what security actually feels like, not the desperate clinging to someone who might leave, but the quiet confidence of choosing someone who chooses to stay. The contrast between this hurricane night and my previous experience feels like comparing paradise to purgatory, because instead of shivering in an airport chair surrounded by strangers while my fiancé celebrates my absence, I'm wrapped in Alexander's university sweatshirt watching the storm's power and beauty from perfect safety, while someone who genuinely cares about my well-being makes sure I'm comfortable and entertained. Alexander has brought books, board games, gourmet takeout from my favorite restaurant, and enough emergency supplies to last a week, not because he expects praise for his thoughtfulness, but because preparing for my comfort during stressful situations is how he naturally expresses affection. My phone buzzes constantly with updates about David and Mrs. Park's misadventures, as their carefully constructed facade crumbles under pressure. David's car actually did break down. Not because of mechanical failure, but because he never maintained it properly since I always provided transportation, and they're currently stranded at LaGuardia Airport in exactly the situation they left me to suffer, except this time there's no one to blame but their own short-sighted selfishness, and no one to rescue them because they've burned every bridge that might have led to help. The photos that other stranded passengers are posting on social media show David and Mrs. Park arguing loudly in the airport terminal, their formal dinner clothes wrinkled and stained, their social climbing masks dropped to reveal the ugly desperation underneath. Alexander's friends start sending updates from various hurricane viewing parties across the city. And the gossip network that governs Manhattan's social hierarchy is buzzing with stories from my dinner party and speculation about what Mrs. Park's insulting comments mean for David's professional prospects and social standing, and I realize that their performance at my penthouse has become the entertainment topic that will carry the wealthy through this storm and probably several months of dinner parties afterward. "Did you hear what that Park woman said about women running businesses?" becomes a refrain that gets repeated with increasing embellishment at every exclusive venue where David had hoped to network himself into acceptance. The justice feels particularly sweet when I receive a call from Jennifer Chen in HR, informing me that David has been terminated from Chen International effective immediately, not for the performance issues we'd documented, but for the security breach of using my personal passwords to access company documents without authorization, a violation that provides legal grounds for dismissal without severance and ensures that David will never work in finance again because his termination record will flag any background check performed by legitimate companies. The IT department discovered that Mr. Park had been using your credentials to access files that weren't related to his job responsibilities, Jennifer explains. And some of those files contained sensitive client information that he had no business viewing, which puts both him and the company at legal risk. But the most satisfying update comes from Alexander's social media, where his network of business ethics professors, environmental activists, and progressive entrepreneurs are sharing stories about David and Mrs. Proplan's Park's behavior at dinner parties, creating a permanent record of their greed and social climbing that will follow them wherever they try to reinvent themselves. And I understand that their reputation destruction is complete and irreversible because they revealed their true character to exactly the people who control access to the life they wanted to steal. Alexander shows me his tablet where business school classmates are posting warnings about David's tendency to take credit for other people's work, where country club members are discussing Mrs. Park's inappropriate comments about family money, and where influential women are making sure that David's name gets flagged in hiring databases as someone who doesn't respect female authority. Alexander and I spend the rest of the storm planning our business partnership and talking about sustainable development projects that could revolutionize international shipping, and I realize that this is what intellectual compatibility feels like, when conversation energizes rather than drains, when ideas build on each other instead of competing for attention, and when planning the future feels exciting instead of exhausting because you're building something together rather than defending your resources from someone who wants to take them. Your family's shipping connections could help us get solar technology to remote communities that need clean energy but lack infrastructure, Alexander says, his eyes bright with genuine enthusiasm. And our environmental certifications could help Chen International attract clients who prioritize sustainability. And I see in his face the same passion for business innovation that drives my own ambitions. David Park now works at a call center in Queens after every major corporation in New York received detailed reports about his fraudulent behavior and attempted embezzlement, while his mother, Mrs. Park's social climbing dreams died when her country club membership was revoked for conduct unbecoming. And sometimes I see them in the tabloids arguing outside divorce court because even their marriage couldn't survive the stress of their spectacular fall from grace. And I understand that karma isn't mystical punishment, but simply the natural consequence of treating people as resources to exploit rather than humans to respect. The tabloid photos show David in discount store clothes waiting for the subway, his once carefully maintained appearance now revealing the mediocrity that expensive styling used to hide, and the articles describe his current job answering customer service calls for a cable company where his charm and people skills translate into being screamed at by frustrated customers for 8 hours a day while earning a fraction of what I used to spend on his monthly allowance. His secretary girlfriend Michelle left him for a hedge fund manager 3 weeks after David's finances collapsed, and their breakup made Page 6 because she publicly accused him of financial fraud and emotional manipulation, creating a permanent record that ensures no woman in New York's social circles will ever trust him again. Mrs. Park's downfall proved even more dramatic because her desperate attempts to maintain social status after David's disgrace led her to make increasingly obvious networking plays that backfired spectacularly, including trying to crash charity events where she wasn't invited and attempting to purchase her way into exclusive organizations that operate on legacy connections rather than immediate payment, and the society pages documented her failures with the brutal efficiency that Manhattan's elite reserves for social climbers who overreach their position. The investigation that followed her country club application revealed previous victims of her manipulation tactics, working-class families she'd convinced to invest in David's business opportunities that never materialized, and several elderly neighbors whose trust funds had been diminished by Mrs. Park's friendly financial advice. David's attempts to rebuild his reputation through dating apps and professional networking events became legendary cautionary tales about the importance of background checks and social verification, because the women he matched with would Google his name and discover the extensive documentation of his gold-digging behavior, while potential employers would find articles about his terminated engagement to Manhattan heiress Isabella Chen and his subsequent workplace firing for security violations and performance issues. The story of our relationship became business school case study material about professional ethics and personal boundaries, ensuring that David's manipulation tactics would be taught as examples of what not to do in corporate relationships. But the most satisfying justice comes from seeing how completely David and Mrs. Park have been forgotten by the social circles they worked so hard to infiltrate, because people who matter in Manhattan don't waste energy hating social climbers, they simply stop seeing them, and David's complete invisibility to the powerful networks he tried to exploit represents a more thorough destruction than any active punishment could achieve. He still lives in his mother's Queens apartment, still dreams about returning to the lifestyle I funded, and still blames me for his problems instead of accepting responsibility for his choices. But his opinion of his situation matters as little as his opinion of mine once did, because people who build their lives on manipulation always end up exactly where they deserve to be, alone, forgotten, and irrelevant. Alexander Montenegro asks me to marry him on the anniversary of Hurricane Miranda, standing in our penthouse as gentle snow falls on the city below, and when I say yes, I realize that surviving that storm in my past life taught me the difference between fair weather love and the kind of devotion that weathers any hurricane life can send, and that true partnership means choosing someone who makes you stronger rather than someone who needs you to be weaker to feel secure about themselves. The engagement ring he designed himself incorporates solar technology into the setting, creating tiny rainbow patterns when light hits the stone, because Alexander understands that symbolic gestures should reflect shared values rather than expensive displays meant to impress other people, and as I watch the light play across the innovative design, I understand that this ring represents everything David's Tiffany promise ring wasn't: thoughtful instead of generic, meaningful instead of costly, and created from love instead of obligation. I wanted something that would remind you every day that our relationship is about building sustainable happiness together. Alexander explains, his voice soft with the kind of vulnerability that comes from genuine emotion rather than manipulative performance. Something that generates its own light instead of just reflecting what other people shine on it. Chen International's stock has reached record highs since Alexander and I announced our business partnership and personal engagement, because investors recognize the power of combining established shipping infrastructure with innovative environmental technology, and the merger of our family companies represents the kind of forward-thinking alliance that positions both enterprises for long-term success rather than short-term profit maximization. Our wedding planning focuses on creating a celebration that reflects our values rather than impressing our guests, with locally sourced food, carbon-neutral transportation, and charitable donations instead of expensive favors, because we've learned that true luxury lies in having choices that align with your principles. My father's recovery from his heart problems accelerated once the stress of David's manipulation was removed from our family dynamics, and he's thrown himself into planning sustainable innovations for Chen International that will honor our shipping legacy while protecting the oceans we depend on for business, and I see in his enthusiasm the joy of someone who no longer has to worry about protecting his life's work from people who would exploit it for personal gain. The board meetings that once felt like defensive strategies against David's influence have transformed into creative sessions where we design solutions to real problems. And I understand that this is what healthy family business feels like: collaboration instead of competition, innovation instead of exploitation. Alexander and I spend our engagement period traveling to sustainable development projects around the world, combining our honeymoon planning with business research that will benefit both our companies and the communities we work with. And every destination teaches us more about building relationships based on mutual benefit rather than resource extraction, whether we're talking about international commerce or personal commitment. Our shared experiences of volunteering at solar installation sites in rural communities and learning about environmental conservation from Indigenous business leaders create the kind of partnership foundation that could survive any storm because we're building something together instead of taking from each other. The penthouse that sheltered me during Hurricane Miranda becomes our permanent home, 40 stories above the chaos of the city, surrounded by the art and books and technology that represent our shared interests, rather than status symbols meant to intimidate visitors. And when the next storm system threatens the eastern seaboard, Alexander and I watch it approach from our living room windows with hot chocolate and emergency supplies in each other's company, secure in the knowledge that we've built, the kind of love that turns disasters into adventures and challenges into opportunities to demonstrate what really matters when everything else gets stripped away by forces beyond our control. The wedding announcement in the Times includes a photo of us on the penthouse balcony during a sunset that turns the city golden below us, and the caption reads, Montenegro and Chen family businesses announce sustainable partnership alongside personal alliance, language that captures how our relationship enhances rather than threatens our individual identities and professional goals. And I think about David reading that announcement in his queen's apartment and understanding finally that he never could have stolen what I have now because it was never available to be taken, only built through the kind of patient, honest work he was never willing to do. As I write my wedding vows in the same office where I once signed documents that almost gave David control of my life, I understand that the greatest revenge isn't causing suffering to people who hurt you. It's building a life so beautiful and secure and authentic that their manipulation becomes irrelevant, their opinions become meaningless, and their absence becomes a gift that creates space for people who deserve to share your happiness. And when Hurricane Miranda's anniversary brings its inevitable storms, Alexander and I will weather them together in our penthouse sanctuary, warm and safe and grateful for the tempest that taught us both how to recognize the difference between shelter and home.